Thank you so much for joining us today at this panel called Lebanon, the Long Road to Reconstruction and Recovery. This webinar series called Afkar Debates. It's organized by the European Institute of the Mediterranean, and it's in its current third edition. Last week, they held a panel about Syria called Syria's political transition between hope and uncertainty. And I really encourage you to watch it on the Institute YouTube channel. Today, we are here to talk about Lebanon with our brilliant panelists, Meray, Maddah, and Aurélie Daher. And I will introduce you to them briefly. And before, I want to talk a little bit about the matter about Lebanon. And in case you're interested in going deeper, because we will only have an hour today, you can check the publication number 73 of Afkar, which was focused on Lebanon and in which today's panelists were also authors. My name is Andrea López-Tomàs, and I'm the Middle East correspondent for the Spanish newspaper El Periódico, which is based in Barcelona, but I'm talking to you from Beirut, which is my home. As most of you probably already know, Lebanon has started a new era. Last fall, the country underwent its most recent war, and during two very long months, Israeli heavily bombed the south of Lebanon, the east of Lebanon, and the southern suburbs of Beirut. But we will talk today about also other areas that were under attack. And since the beginning of the hostilities, after the Hamas attack on the 7th of October of 2023, and the Israeli aggression against Gaza, around 4,500 people have been killed in Lebanon, and more than 1 million people were displaced from their homes. Still today, there are tens of thousands who have not been able to return to their homes, especially in the south of Lebanon. And at the end of November, on November 26th, Israel and Hezbollah reached a ceasefire that has been constantly violated by Israeli forces, and until the point that the Israeli army is still present in 5 strategic points in Lebanon, which clearly violates the ceasefire. And after these 2 months of heavy bombing and very dramatic attacks, the Lebanese militia and political party Hezbollah has been severely weakened, and that also allowed, in a way, the political blockade in Lebanon to be broken after almost 3 years without a president and a government. And also, we have to take into consideration that this has been taking place during one of the hardest economic times for Lebanon. The World Bank said that the Lebanese economic crisis is one of the worst economic crises worldwide since the 1850s. And now we're facing ahead of us a long road of reconstruction and recovery, because there are still many villages in the south and the east of Lebanon, especially the southern suburbs of Beirut, that are heavily destroyed, and with institutions, the Lebanese institutions, in rubble already before the war. So this will be a very interesting and I think very relevant conversations to have now. And before we start, I will introduce to you our panelists. Aurélie Daher is an associate professor in political science at University of Paris-Dauphine, at the Institut Pratique du Journalisme and Science Po in Paris. At Paris-Dauphine, she is co-head of a master's program in conflict transformation and peace studies, and she's also a member of the Academic Integrity Committee of the university. Her research focuses on Hezbollah, Middle Eastern Shiism, Lebanese and Middle Eastern politics. And she also works on the new aspects of the Middle Eastern jihadism and its repercussions on European societies. Meray Maddah is a PhD candidate at the Politics and Public Administration Department in the University of Konstanz, and her research examines how national political structures interact with international parliamentary engagement and international organizations. She investigates how the transnational behavior of members of parliament shape political representation, legitimacy, and reform compliance, particularly in autocratic and hybrid systems. Currently, she's a visiting scholar at Harvard's Department of Government, and a global fellow at Brown's University Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. At the end of this session, you will have 40 minutes to ask questions to both our panelists, and you can write them in the chat, in the Q&A section during the conversation. So maybe first we can start with Aurélie. Now, finally, Lebanon has a new president and a new government. But there are still, they have many challenges ahead of them and very little time to do them, because in May 2026, there will be elections again. So in this context, what are the main obstacles currently hindering stable governance in Lebanon?
Yes, well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, the Hori team, for organizing this event, which I think is pretty much relevant. Yes, Lebanon is definitely at a crossroads, and so many questions, so many challenges ahead of the new team. Because as you said it, Andrea, finally we have a new president, Joseph Aoun. He's a Maronite Christian, former head of the Lebanese army, was elected in early January this year after an institutional crisis that left Lebanon without a president for more than 2 years. And then Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, who's a Sunni Muslim, became head of the new government a month later, which is early February. So now in Lebanon, the presidential position comes with rather few prerogatives. So it's mainly a position of representation of protocol. I'm obviously not trying to belittle Joseph Aoun's potential role in carrying out the reforms needed in Lebanon. But it goes without saying that most of the work in reality is going to be on the prime minister's plate and that of the government, as they are constitutionally the power engine of the executive power. And so to answer your questions, sorry, more precisely, yes, the challenges awaiting for them are many, and one must stay quite Herculean. Most commentators and media focus on the Hezbollah factor as if it was like the alpha and omega of all the problems in Lebanon. It is definitely a tricky question, but it's unfortunately just one of many pieces of the puzzle. And of course, there is the economic crisis that needs to be dealt with urgently. You mentioned the collapse of the economy in 2019, one of the most severe in the history of the modern world. But today, the reconstruction challenge after the war just piled over the economic difficulties, amongst which the weakness of the Lebanese national currency, which lost up to 90% of its worth since 2019, and the banking crisis also inherited from 2019. So they were playing actually too much. The Ponzi game eventually led the Lebanese banks into hijacking, and actually one could say objectively stealing the deposits by billions of dollars formerly belonging to hundreds of thousands of Lebanese average citizens. So if we were to rank the priorities and together the obstacles of the new government, I would say the main challenge is going to first and foremost to boost the Lebanese economy and the Lebanese pound, and try to give back to those Lebanese citizens their savings, or at least a large part of them. That would definitely be with the reconstruction and financing the reconstruction in the top 5. The question is, where are we going to find the money? And then there's another obstacle and big challenge is the Israeli issue. Israel has, as you mentioned it, reoccupied lately a part of the Lebanese territory. We hear in Tel Aviv officials talking about annexating a part of the Lebanese territory, just like Israel already tried to do in the 80s and the 90s. Israel also, as you mentioned, is not into doing its part when it comes to apply the ceasefire agreement of November. Israel is using its right to defend itself to attack Lebanese citizens, destroy Lebanese properties, sabotage state and private infrastructures, in spite of the fact that they have nothing to do with Hezbollah. So for the Lebanese government, a new occupation and a loss of sovereignty are a new problem. But there's also the fact that the Lebanese army is not yet capable of fulfilling that role of freeing and protecting the national land. And that paradoxically reinforces Hezbollah's position amongst quite a lot of Lebanese people, starting with the people of the south or the northeast. And finally, if I may add very quickly, with your permission, other challenges also await the Lebanese government, but are quite less talked of. And amongst them, I would definitely mention education on one hand, and sectarian animosity on the other. Regarding education, the economic crisis of 2019 seriously damaged the proper course of training for hundreds of thousands of pupils and students alike. The problem is that those pupils and students are the next generations. They are the ones who are supposed to invest in a better Lebanon. They are the next economic and political elites, the next doctors, the next lawyers, engineers, scholars, politicians. And a proper reform, whatever we can start today, it won't stick if we don't have people in the next following years being able to sustain it. Good education plus good education also means an educated diaspora. And God knows, everybody knows that in Lebanon, the diaspora is definitely one of the main economic levers right now that can basically help quite a lot of the Lebanese population survive. So good education means also an educated diaspora that will be able to get lucrative positions outside Lebanon and send money back home. And again, that's not something Lebanon can do without. And finally, I was talking about sectarian animosity. That's definitely not something that as Lebanese we can be proud of, but it is there. And we have to basically own our mistakes, and we have to call a spade a spade. And I would definitely seriously start working on, I don't know, a law on media and freedom of expression, because we have today people in the parliament, in the government, even in the media, and obviously on social media, who are spilling their sectarian venom and dangerously provocative speeches everywhere, as I said, in the public sphere. And that's definitely the last thing that Lebanon needs right now. Reform, reconstruction, economic prosperity needs security, but also social stability, serenity, not incitations to civil violence.
Thank you so much for this clear picture of all the challenges ahead, and for mentioning especially the last two, which is something we usually don't focus on. We usually tackle more the urgent things, and when this is something key for the Lebanese state and the Lebanese society. I mean, as we have said, the Lebanese institutions are in a deplorable state, and they were before the war, and now even worse. So it is obvious that there is going to be a need for international actors to join the efforts of this process of reconstruction, as there has been in previous post-war times. We'll remember after the 2006 war how many actors from abroad came in to help Lebanon. But this also has its risk in a very fragile country such as Lebanon. So I wanted to ask you, Meray, how can the international support aid reconstruction efforts, but without deepening the divisions in Lebanese society?
Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for the invite, and thank you to Andrea and the entire IMET team. I'm going to take it from the many really good points mentioned by Aurélie, is that departing from an institutional perspective, and specifically in the case of Lebanon, the salient issue or assumption here that these formal institutions in the Lebanese state have been continuously weak and to some extent paralyzed, even ex ante to the 1975 civil war, historically speaking, since even then socioeconomic inequalities persisted and were also coupled by rising sectarian tensions. So along this continuum, there were several external and internal shocks, such as the Israeli invasion in 78 and 82, 2006 war, as mentioned, the May 7th clashes, the numerous assassinations that we have seen over the years when it comes to high-level figures and politicians, the Beirut port blast, obviously, and the many, many protests that we have seen on the ground, including with the culmination of the October 17th protest movement. And obviously, all of this is under the canopy, but since 2019 with the free fall of the national economy and the banking sector. So among many of those shocks, really, they have shaped the path dependency of these institutions institutions, which really compelled the need to have the international community's intervention when the state's capacity is at its absolute weakest in this case. So even within this predictor, this weakness and fragility of the Lebanese state, there is still variation. For example, and as mentioned, is that if we look again back to these events, the state's capacity in Lebanon really fluctuated over the years in a way, but also at the same time is that one of the worst culminations and expositions as we have come to face is that the economic downfall and the dollarization of its national economy and really mounting debt. It's really put kind of the reality into the face of seeing how weak is the state's capacity really. But also, again, from kind of an institutional perspective, is that if we look kind of at the numbers, so one of the latest waves from the Arab Barometer from 2024, we see that Lebanon is among the lowest ranking countries when it comes to the public opinion's trust in the government, where it ranks the lowest relative to other surveyed countries in the Arabic-speaking world. It lands on about 7% for trust in government and 9% for trust in the parliament. And even the local government, in its case, it's not really immune, as Lebanon is also tied to about the 25th percentile among those who also say that they have a lot or a great deal of trust when it comes to the local government. So we're speaking about extremely low numbers in comparison to other countries. But the case of the international support aiding reconstruction without deepening divisions is, unfortunately, I argue, is not really plausible, as the baseline is already very susceptible to rising tensions and different forms of inequalities. Because if we take a kind of the scope conditions of what Lebanon is facing right now and what it is essentially, it's an extremely fragile state that is prone to different catastrophes from every aspect. And no one, I argue, is under the impression that simply because there's a president now with the appointment of Joseph Aoun or the Prime Minister of Salam, that these kind of band-aid solutions can assist the country through a top-bottom process. But at the same time, on the other hand, what is really needed from the international support or the international community in this case is that a reconciliation with the reality that in a post-conflict society such as Lebanon that is already predisposed to low institutional trust, foreign aid alone cannot really mend a broken social contract between the people themselves. And they cannot really expect that, or international actors cannot really expect that foreign systems will somehow lead to a form of national equilibrium within the Lebanese state, where such expectations are fundamentally misplaced, regardless of how substantial or well-intentioned they are. Because the country already, it faces deep-seated divisions in itself along different axes. So whether it is among the people from different socioeconomic or ethno-religious background, but also among the people and the government itself. And it's also important to really predispose this, is that we cannot really propagate, or we cannot really suppose that any activity propagated by the international back support will automatically be accepted just because the void is simply there. Just to add as also a couple of final notes is that it's already, and as mentioned, is that we have seen the precedent with the 2006 war where different donor conferences were held then by different regional international actors. And with the aftermath of it, and remembering correctly, the pledges reached about 7.6 billion from the Paris donor conference. But even then, the Lebanese government struggled to disperse that aid efficiently, and really it reflected its weak institutional capacity and entrenchment in this sectarian power-sharing kind of arrangement. So what this ultimately boils down to is the need to recalibrate how the international engagement with Lebanon is approached, not really through short-term technocratic fixes or top-down policy prescriptions, but by really acknowledging the hybrid nature of governance that Lebanon has on the ground and the limits of external intervention in the absence of a very meaningful internal reform. Because if there's something that we already know is that looking into research into post-conflict institutional recovery is that this form of legitimacy cannot really be externally manufactured, nor can those institutions really be imported wholesale in some form or another. So any form of meaningful reconstruction process, whether it may be from the international community or coming from the state itself, is that it must really move beyond this sort of illusion of a quick fix and instead engage with a very long and quite uneven and inherently political work of trying to rebuild a social contract from the ground up, specifically for the people's interest in the beginning.
Thank you so much for that. I also want to encourage both of you, if you have anything to add to each other's response. This is a conversation, so it will make it even more enriching. And I wanted to talk about something that you mentioned briefly before, Aurélie, about civil conflict in Lebanon, because we see it's a country very prone to it, and there's always fears among the society. Like they always, me as someone living in Lebanon, I have experience. Everyone is always like, no, there's a civil war coming. There's always this idea, and I mean, during the war, Israel attacked areas outside Hezbollah's control, or where Hezbollah was more present, and they were areas that were housing displaced people, and it seemed like it was an attempt to fuel sectarian tensions. So at that time, it didn't work, and even in some of the speeches by Benjamin Netanyahu, he was encouraging the society, you know, to fuel these divisions in order to fight against Hezbollah. The Lebanese society, of course, didn't follow Israeli orders. But is there still nowadays the possibility of civil conflict taking place in Lebanon?
Yes, that's an excellent question, because yes, quite a lot of people, and not just in Lebanon, talk about like the risk of seeing a new civil war in Lebanon. I mean, I hear it from quite a lot of analysts and experts. Yeah, I mean, definitely a civil war would be a blessing for the Israelis. I don't think, however, that it is a serious option in spite of everything, and God knows that the everything is big. The first reason, actually, I have two main reasons to think that. And the first reason is that it takes two to tango. A civil war is possible when at least groups of similar size, weight, or means are both into the idea. If one of the competing groups do not want to be drawn into a full-blown violent conflict, then it's not going to happen. That does not mean that we won't have episodes of civil violence. But civil violence is one thing, civil war is another. The Shia today, who are the most harshly targeted community, obviously because this is where Hezbollah is most present. So the Shia today, they are quite targeted, but there isn't today a collective will amongst the Shia to change the political situation through high-scale violence. Now, my other argument is the fact that the Shia today represent somewhere between 55, maybe up to 60% of the population. Obviously, it's impossible to have accurate numbers. The last time we had an official census was in 1932. But the people but that's basically an estimation, based on various other indicators. More than half of the Lebanese populations, for sure, is Shia. While people in favor of a radical action against them, I would say they stand for like the guys who are really motivated. I mean, who would really go for it. I don't know, 5-10% maybe of the society. The Shia are more numerous. They have better weapons, and they know how to fight. Again, we have to call a spade a spade. So if hypothetically things were to go seriously sour, it would take a few hours for the Shia to organize what I would call, well, not a civil war, obviously, but a sectarian coup d'etat. You know what? We wouldn't have enough time for a civil war. Civil wars need time to become civil wars, to be officially recognized as such. I'm talking months, sometimes a bit over a year. And that's what we saw actually in Lebanon in the 70s, or in Syria actually in the early 2010s. Nobody wakes up one day and say, today is the beginning of a civil war. And actually, even when people start to realize that they're stuck in one, you always have another part of the population who is in denial. No, there's no civil war. And actually, for quite some time in Lebanon, we didn't even talk about the civil war. We talked about the events, al-ahdas. Go to Bosnia, they will say the same thing. They never talk about civil war. They say the events. Go to Ireland, same thing. So back to basically Lebanon. My thought is that if the Shia came to feel one day that the provocations by their rivals came to a point that were to be the straw that brought the camel's back, again, things would be handled, I think, quickly and neatly, if I may say. I'm sorry to be blunt, but again, we have to call a spade a spade. That's why I was talking about the need for a more strict regulation of the hate speech and public arena. It is time, it is time, it is long overdue for the Lebanese to understand and accept, accept that they are all stuck with each other. So they should rather start getting to know each other and work on what brings them together than focusing on what opposes them. Just saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point to make, and something quite urgent to happen soon in Lebanon. And as we have already talked about, we have mentioned the economic dimension of the many crises that Lebanon is going through, but there was this crisis before the war. Now there are most urgent needs caused by the war, as many people don't have a house anymore, but still the needs, the necessities that were present before the war are still persisting in Lebanon nowadays. So Meray, I wanted to ask you if you can help us understand how can, I know it's a very big question, so to talk about tackling this economic crisis, and especially restoring trust in state institutions, which is something you've mentioned, that Lebanon is one of the lowest countries in this number. So how can this be fixed? Do we have any solutions that we should start with?
Right. So a very quick solutions, unfortunately, I don't think it's kind of viable in this case, but to start again from trust is that one of the biggest downfalls regarding trust in Lebanon state institutions is that essentially how it provided a cover for the private banking sector with the economic freefall, when depositors, fundamentally, they were victims to that very cover and essentially mismanagement of people's life savings and assets, people that have worked for decades on end, and then they have seen all of their savings just completely evaporate into thin air due to that mismanagement and corruption, which was endemic to the system, and the public knew about it, but still they did not know how deeply it is really embedded in this case. So in this case is that I see it more of a client patron network that really entrenches Lebanon's system. And because many figures in state institutions are, or at least were to a great degree, entrenched in Lebanon's banking sector. So the issue here, the way that I see it, it becomes endogenous, is that how can trust be built in state institutions that not only fail to protect citizens and their livelihoods and their and everything that means that really means importantly, like in a very important way, but at the same time, in many cases, they have been also actively benefit from that very collapse that they have presided over. So exactly where do we start? So this really begs the question of who comes first in this case, because if trust is not really found among those institutions or within them or towards them, then we can really not expect any form of economic recovery, or anything. It would be overly sluggish and simply not as viable. We have already seen, as a couple of points mentioned by Aurélie, is that how the migration of different parts of the population increased over the years and substantially after the economic freefall, where people are either choosing to live in different countries or making their livelihoods abroad, some of them even, or to a smaller part, taking their businesses abroad. But we are yet to see how in the long run this kind of will look like, because the real outcome might have some sort of a lagged effect, but still we can assume that none of the traditional kind of markers of economic recovery will show anytime soon on Lebanon. But also to add importantly is that we can see the discrepancies between the different economic classes in Lebanon. That was already a persistent issue, but even more so after 2019, because when we see that that kind of division is extremely apparent, where the middle class almost at this point is non-existent, poverty levels have already reached very unprecedented records. So all of those kind of different dominators coming together, it really creates a recipe for disaster. And not only this, but it wouldn't really lead to any form of healthy or sustainable economic recovery. One of the things actually that happened, for example, this month is after an IMF fact-finding mission recently included its visit to Beirut. And even then is that in order to explore any kind of possibility for an IMF-supported program, especially especially when it comes to those reforms. And also I have to mention that this was something that was formally requested by the Lebanese Authority for a new program, because they wanted to emphasize an urgent need for a coordinated sort of assistance when it comes to remedying the country's very severe economic distress. But also this came after very short-term policy effects, like they tried to end the fiscal deficit or eliminating a certain monetary financing and foreign exchange subsidies, all of this in order to improve the revenue, but also to try to stabilize the inflation that we have seen it in Lebanon over the years. But these essentially, again, those are not long-term solutions for a full-time recovery. I mean, the result of the meeting was yet another pledge, as we have seen over the years by the IMF, towards a reform program that is really focused on fiscal and debt sustainability, the restructuring of the final sector, many of those things that also some people within or certain actors within the protest movement, for example, have called for. But at the same time is that this really comes also with the appointment of a new head we have seen, for example, this week of the central bank after the tenure of Riyad Salemi, which came with its own corruption files and waste of public resources. So in order to accomplish any of those benefits or to release any of them, those reforms, they should happen on the ground itself. And we are yet to see exactly how those would look like. As mentioned before by Andrea, is that not only did the World Bank say that it's one of the most costly crises that ever took place in Lebanon, but now after a recent report is that they indicated that it would take up to $11 billion in order just to full the reconstruction part after the 14th month war. So this already is such a large estimate. I would just add a very simple point is that ultimately this kind of Lebanon's path to economic recovery is really quite inseparable from the restoration of institutional trust, because no amount of external financing or technical reform will create any type of long-term results if the public themselves, they continue to perceive state institutions as corrupt, as very self-captured or very self-serving. So in this case is that the IMF or the World Bank, they might outline those kind of very ambitious reform frameworks for the Lebanese state, but they cannot really gain traction in a society such as Lebanon, where accountability is not really there and confidence in the rule of law is fractured. So in this case, any genuine form of reform must really begin with rebuilding legitimacy and not just by trying to balance certain budgets here and there.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point you're making about trust and accountability, which is one of the fights that was most dominating in Lebanon before the war, when we maybe won't have time to mention it, but to talk about the port blast in Beirut in August 2020, and how there are still no one has been held accountable for what happened, and that killed 200 people and injured so many and devastated half of the city. Going to something more newsworthy, which is maybe what most are focusing on the most pressing issue on Lebanese politics nowadays. No, everyone talks about Hezbollah's disarmament, and this is something that not only can affect Lebanon, but as we have already seen in the past, it has affected regional dynamics. And many people in Lebanon see that now it's like the momentum to do that. Like there has never been a greater time to push for Hezbollah to give up its weapon. And I think in this matter, we need to talk about the regional dimension and about Iran. But Aurélie, how feasible it is to disarm Hezbollah in the current context in Lebanon right now?
Yes, thank you. That's definitely the elephant in the room. Yes, we hear in the media and quite a lot of commentators are into like now it is possible. Finally, we have a window of opportunity to disarm Hezbollah. I wouldn't say that many believe it is feasible. Probably way more hope for it, wish for it. That's definitely true. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that those same many believe that it is feasible, between what you wish for and what you can. Sometimes there's a big differential. And we have to be very careful with our brain, because usually our brains tend to believe more easily and adopt more easily the ideas that suit their ideological preferences. Unfortunately, the reality is not always on our brain side. So the Hezbollah leadership themselves made it very clear that it was not something that, I mean, I'm talking their disarmament, that it's not something they're ready to consider. Quite the opposite. They made a few warnings, they formulated a few warnings regarding anyone who would like to try to push that disarmament by force. What they are, however, ready to discuss, they're saying, is a national defense strategy where Hezbollah and the army, to make a very long story short, where Hezbollah and the army in particular would have complementary roles. Okay, now it is not something new. It's already a discussion that was started between the main political parties of the countries back in 2006, yeah, 2006, a little bit 2007. At some point, it came to a rather elaborate formula. I don't know if it was really functional, but anyways, you know, people, I mean, politicians really worked on it. But then back then, unfortunately, the political tensions eventually put everything on hold. But obviously, Hezbollah now is hoping to revive the whole process. Now, what we have to keep in mind, and the American case is actually a very telling one, is that disarming a society, because Hezbollah at the end of the day is a group that comes from the society. It is a part of the Lebanese society. So disarming Hezbollah is disarming a society or a part of the society. So disarming a society is not an easy task, especially when the society is opposed to it. You know, the Americans, after every time we have, I mean, every time we have a big shooting on the streets or in schools, the Americans have been trying to do it for decades, and obviously it's not working. And I mentioned earlier the fact that the Shia were the largest community. Well, most Shia today, and by the way, not only Shia, because significant parts of the Christians, the Sunnis, also support Hezbollah, or at least they support the military part of Hezbollah. So quite a lot of Lebanese are opposed to the disarmament of Hezbollah, especially in a context where Israel is occupying a part of the south once more and has obviously an unconditional Western green light to violate the Lebanese sovereignty, attack regular citizens, kill them, destroy their houses, burn their fields quite freely. I was talking about the hate discourse a little bit earlier. You know, both that hate discourse in Lebanon against the Shia and the Israeli actions against the country are paradoxically serving Hezbollah's cause and bringing back, and that's definitely what I saw on the ground a few weeks ago. You know, it's bringing back on the Hezbollah ship quite a lot of people who, after the ceasefire of November, were seriously thinking about, or actually maybe already left the resistance mode to the past. In other words, Hezbollah's harshest enemies, this is basically the joke is on them, because the Hezbollah's harshest enemies, I don't know if they're aware of it, but whether in Lebanon or outside of it, are serving Hezbollah's cause, as paradoxical as it may sound. And then obviously you talked about the regional situation in Iran. So we have obviously what is happening in Syria, the bloody events in the northwest part of the country that we witnessed a few weeks ago, the persecutions against the Alawites and the Alawis, and then the Israeli expansion in southern Syria. They're all good news for pro-Iran parties, not just Hezbollah. They're good news for Iran, for the whole axis of resistance, as weak as we can see it today. And if Syria is to turn eventually into a crypto-federal state, then Tehran will still be welcome in some part of it, meaning by extension also Hezbollah. Israel is definitely giving the Syrians nowadays in the south, for instance, reasons to renew their rancor against Tel Aviv. And lately, I don't know if you noticed it, I don't know if the audience noticed it, but a few days ago, we have just seen a new addition to the axis of resistance. We witnessed the foundation of something called Jabhat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya fi Syria, so literally the Islamic Resistance Front in Syria, which presents itself as a resistance movement that just started to organize against Israeli occupation. And actually this creation was saluted by Ayatollah Khamenei himself. And the name of the organization is quite interesting because it quite resembles that of the military part of Hezbollah. Hezbollah's military part is called Al-Muqawama Al-Islamiyya fi Lebanon, the Islamic resistance in Lebanon. So if I were to caricature a little bit, I would say Israel just caused now the emergence of a Syrian Hezbollah. So yes, the whole axis of resistance did take a severe blow, but I wouldn't bury it too quickly. I'm sorry to play the Cassandra or the barrier of bad news, but again, you know, when you want to defeat your enemies, you have to be realistic about the real situation. And I don't think it's serving ourselves to just go with, okay, Hezbollah is completely done. It's over. 2 weeks time, they won't have any weapons again. The Lebanese army is going to take care of it. Iran is out of the game. No more axis of resistance. That's the best way for us, actually, or I mean, for everyone who believes in or who hopes for exactly that, to be quite disappointed.
Yeah. We'll have to keep an eye on how these things develop, not just in Lebanon, but as you said, in the region. And one last question for Meray before we go into the Q&A. And throughout the war, we have witnessed how civil society organizations have been the ones leading the emergency response, especially when it comes to helping the most vulnerable communities, such as Syrian refugees or migrant domestic workers. We have seen how many of the services in Lebanese society are provided by organizations, by NGOs, and by even like foreign organizations like that. So which role can they now adopt in the process of reconstruction?
Right. So from the process so far, from the conversations that we have already uncovered, that Lebanon is facing a myriad of overlapping crises, whether it's the war or economic collapse to a political system that is completely in paralysis. So in this context, Andrea, is that's right. It's that it is also one of the things that I argue within the dossier is that the civil society has once again stepped in to fill in that vacuum that is left by the state, that is unable in many cases and unwilling even to meet even the most basic needs of its people. So throughout the war, we have seen that many of those organizations have led the humanitarian response, providing shelter, food, medicine, even psychosocial support to vulnerable groups, whether it was Syrian refugees, migrant domestic workers, or anyone really that have been displaced as a function of the war itself, and as we have seen specifically in the South. Those efforts are obviously commendable and they're vital, but it's also unrealistic and unsustainable to expect that the entire civil society to carry the weight and burden of long-term reconstruction, especially without any proper institutional backing or any form of financial support in that vacuum of which the state should step in. So that kind of expectation not only overextends them in a way, but also it risks reinforcing the very dysfunction that they're trying to counter in this way. If we look again back to kind of take it from a reconstruction angle, is that civil society has played a crucial but not substitutive role, and nor should it be the substitute to the state itself, because their closeness to the ground, their community trust, for example, as we have seen through many different grassroots organizations, their ability to respond quite flexibly makes them really essential in shaping an inclusive recovery effort. They can also help ensure aid reach, for example, certain areas that may not be as cosmopolitan or specifically in certain rural areas. But at the same time is that we also have seen that in previous war periods, this particular context is that it might reinforce exclusion or certain forms of clientelism. For example, back in the 2006 war, where reconstruction funds were often distributed along sectarian tandems, and even some of them, they were within kind of the echelon of grassroots organizations or civil society organizations that may have an inkling in relation to a certain political party or a certain sectarian dynamic. So in this case is that we really have to be cautious, essentially, because if civil society becomes the default provider of services provision while the state remains absent or unaccountable, we're essentially letting the government off the hook, and that's not really a solution. If anything, it's only a delayed tactic, because civil society should really focus on advocacy and oversight and transparency and the things that we kind of aspire to within a representative parliamentary democracy, or at least on paper it should be the case, but not really replacing the state permanently. And also, this is just to add that reconstruction isn't just about rebuilding homes, as far as we have seen is that so many people have lost theirs, but it's also about, again, rebuilding that trust. So here civil society can really somehow push for deeper, more structural reforms by advocating for participatory governance or supporting marginalized communities, mobilizing grassroots initiatives. We have seen many of those, for example, that came after the October 17th movement, although many of them also, they have pre-existed before then. So these aren't necessarily add-ons, but also they're fundamental to any type of overarching recovery that we hope Lebanon would see at some point, and through a sustainable lens. So civil society, of course, must be part of that particular recovery, but not as a substitute for the state, because their power essentially it lies in mobilizing and advocating and holding institutions to account. But if we want to have a different outcome in this case, reconstruction efforts, they must include and also strengthen civil society, while including and ensuring that the state is finally able to step up to meet its constitutional responsibilities in this case, because otherwise we really risk repeating the same cycle: short-term fixes, donor fatigue, growing public disillusionment, especially from the public themselves. So in this case, Lebanon doesn't really need another band-aid. It needs a transformation. And civil society is one of those actors that can help us lead or to get there, but they could not be the leaders in this case. And especially they shouldn't do it alone in the absence of the state and its resources and capacities all in one.
Yeah, I think it is a very relevant point to just highlight the fact that it shouldn't be the role of the people to take care of themselves. So I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A, so I have some other questions for you. And while we wait, if someone wants to ask something directly, they can do it in the chat, as I already said at the beginning of our conversation. But maybe following up with what you were talking about civil society organizations, there's this question that I think it's not being talked about much. Because besides Lebanon being home to many NGOs and United Nations agencies, and they are the ones providing services to a lot of communities, but we're seeing now that there is especially an effort led by the Trump administration, but maybe some other European countries might follow, of withdrawing funds to these kind of organizations. So I mean, it's undeniable that the Lebanese economy benefits, of course, by the presence of these organizations, and the presence of maybe even expats or international staff that come to the country to work, and sometimes even to gentrify some neighborhoods. But how can this withdrawal of funds, or these efforts to stop giving money to help other peoples in other countries, especially by the Trump administration, impact Lebanon and its economy?
Right. Within the context of Lebanon is that it has long relied on governmental organizations or INGOs or UN agencies, and we have seen them not only centralized within the district of Beirut, but really essentially all over the country, and relied on that international funding. But also one of the main reasons as to they were there, again, speaking about the vacuum, is that to fill those kind of critical services provisions gaps that the state still cannot or will not meet for the interest of its people. So, and we're talking about a variation of sectors here, right? So from health and education to refugee assistance. So it's often really these actors, not the government, that are delivering a form of an essential support assistance on the ground, and having that communal trust with the people, because they see it's those actors that are providing me, for example, this opportunity or this service or whatnot. So when we talk about something like the current administration's withdrawal of funds, especially to agencies like USAID affiliated programs, which is quite central in Lebanon's civil society organization space, and many of the local grassroots initiatives, they do essentially get their funding from that agency. The impact Is it just symbolic? I feel it's quite structural because the funding cut has really a ripple effect across multiple layers within the Lebanese society. Because first, it means fewer resources for refugee communities, whether we're talking about Palestinians or Syrians, who already live in very precarious conditions from the get-go. But beyond that, it also has weakened the local economies that have become quite interlinked with these aid systems. So we're talking about staff basically losing their jobs, municipalities receiving less support, specifically in rural areas in Lebanon, because these are one of those areas that really experience one of the harshest the downsides of what we see or what we have seen within the economic downfall. Also hospitals and schools, they've seen cuts in these kind of services delivery. So all of this in the midst of a very unraveling economy, basically. So the withdrawal really exposed how deeply embedded international funding is in Lebanon, which has been a story that is longest time, specifically in its economic ecosystem. And also, again, it revealed how fragile the model is when it hinges on external goodwill rather than actual domestic capacity. So these partnerships have unfortunately been destabilized even further. And as we have seen in certain places, is that those local organizations, especially ones that don't necessarily have one of the biggest resources, they were really left scrambling. So I think here that the takeaway isn't just the funding cuts they hurt, of course they do, but also Lebanon needs to rethink that kind of long-term sustainability of a system where foreign actors are the de facto providers of core social services where the state cannot provide them. So unless there's a stronger public sector backbone and a genuine state strategy for that services provision, any shift in global funding, I think, in priorities will always be more of a shockwave on the ground, but it doesn't really have any sustainable outcome, so to speak.
Yeah, we have one question that I'm gonna ask you. Ivan Diaz asks, I'd like to ask the panelists their opinion about how the current political process in Syria will impact Lebanon. I mean, we saw last week how the governments of Syria and Lebanon broker a ceasefire after the most violent clashes in the border between like different forces from each side since the fall of Assad. So how do you think this political process in Syria and how are going to be the new relations between the neighboring countries?
Okay. Should I go first or?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's a very good question, and at the same time, it's a $1 billion kind of question. I would say so far what we saw is the impact is mainly at two levels. It's twofold. The first, obviously, is the security related issue, where basically the border between Lebanon and Syria is can be sometimes, especially in the northeast, a little bit blurry. So Lebanon is a country and that in its constitution defines very clearly its borders. The problem is that the two countries never sat around a table to validate and to confirm where exactly the border goes through. So we do have areas, as I said, especially in the border between Syria and Lebanon, that is a little bit blurry, and that is obviously used as a pretext for various groups to act there in a form of we are in an area where we're not really sure whether things are legal or illegal, where we are exactly Lebanese territory, Syrian territory, so Lebanese sovereignty or Syrian sovereignty. And we saw basically the impact that it had during the civil war in Syria in the early 2010s. But also more recently, where groups who either took some liberty from the Syrian central power or groups coming from, answering to leaderships who officially and very openly announced defection from and cutting ties with the with the authority of Damascus. Basically, we saw those groups taking actions against Lebanese areas, mainly Shia and Christian areas in the northeast, so that's one problem. The question is, will Damascus be able to build or to finish building a completely integrated army that answers to the orders of Damascus only? Because so far, from what we heard from the meetings between the Lebanese president Joseph Aoun and the Syrian president Ahmed Shara, what we heard is that, on paper at least, they agree on mutual respect of the borders, mutual respect of both sovereignties. In the same time, in practice, things are a little bit different. So that's one first problem. The second problem is what we're going to do with the refugees, the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So the Lebanese population is somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million people. In 2015, basically, Lebanon welcomed on its territory up to 1.5, and at sometimes even after that 2 million Syrian refugees. So that's almost one refugee for two nationals, and that obviously, as you can imagine, had a major impact on the economy, on the labor market, on the real estate market, education, etc., etc. And obviously that also created tensions between the Lebanese society and the Syrian refugees. We were talking about the aids, international aid. Also, you have a rancor amongst quite a lot of Lebanese people against the Syrian refugees, whom they seen as being privileged in having access to that international aid, in the sense that the way they see it, the Lebanese see it, is that the Syrian refugees get aid from basically more than one source. It's like the US, it's the European Union, is the UN, etc. And while basically the Lebanese, especially those who were the most severely hit by the serious economic crisis, do not have access to that many possibilities. So there's a feeling that the Lebanese are poor in their own countries while the refugees are doing better. Whether that representation is true or not, basically it is definitely something that is quite, it's a very shared representation amongst the Lebanese society, and that, as I said, creates tension on the ground. The question is, that was pushed forward after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, is it time for at least a large part of those refugees to go home? And what happened is we didn't see them massively go home. Quite the opposite. We saw, especially after the persecutions of the Alawis in the north, we saw actually hundreds of them coming and adding up to the ones who were there. So we have a little bit of a situation like in Argentina after the Second World War, where basically, so in Lebanon we have the pro-Assads and the anti-Assads being both refugees in the same country. That also creates a kind of a weird situation and a territorialization of their presence. Basically, depending on their ideological preferences, they're going to be massively present in a certain area rather than another area in Lebanon. So that's also a problem for the Lebanese government, because the way they see it is those refugees are both a challenge to the economy, but also, as it is presented in the Lebanese debate, to the Lebanese national identity, because obviously there's a fear that those people will never leave, that potentially they could get the citizenship, and that would bring obviously they would aggravate what some people in Lebanon see an imbalance in the confessional distribution within the society. So that is definitely or potentially gasoline on the public debate in Lebanon.
We have one last question that maybe we have to finish in 2 minutes, but maybe we can fit it in. The question says, what role do the Druze play, and would you consider them relevant actors? Also, would you say their identity is exploited by Israel? Do any of you dare to answer this question about the Druze in Lebanon?
Meray, do you want to go? Right.
Sure. I just wanted to add just very final points to what Aurélie has really correctly mentioned in this case when it comes to this political brokerage between the two governments themselves, because although it's very early to tell, it's quite uncharted territory again, and at first it was perceived to be this kind of positive step, but I think it's too early to speak of normalized or even stable relations between the two governments, which quite essentially one of them is through transition and another one just appointed different political figureheads after a long years of vacuum. So in this case, is that how those things will interplay together? We're yet to see how would that kind of crystallize in the future. But it really kind of brings forth this new political landscape, so to speak, because it might offer opportunities for rethinking cooperation if I'm being kind of cautiously optimistic in this case. For example, there might be cases of bilateral coordination when it comes to reconstruction, because again, and understandably so, is that within the border itself, is that those are the areas that have been really heavily impacted by much of the downfall, and also by what we have seen in certain cases of insecurity vacuums or enclaves within the border itself. But again, is that I think we need to be cautious, is that because if both sides were able to kind of broker a ceasefire in this case, it doesn't mean that the power dynamics have really shifted in a meaningful way, because again, both of them remain in a status of fragility, and cooperation with Syria becomes kind of overly securitized in this very delicate period. It could also reignite certain internal tensions with Lebanon itself, because we do know how very much polarizing the Syrian file has been historically, whether it has been during the time of the Syrian forces' occupation in Lebanon or now with the ongoing Syrian refugee crisis. In terms of the second question, I would kind of throw it to Aurélie a little bit.
Okay, regarding the Druzes, in Lebanon, we have a funny situation because obviously the Druzes are a very small part of the Lebanese society, but they have a rather decent representation in the parliament. That is, if we were to do a little bit of math in terms of proportions, they have a share that is bigger than what they represent in the society. They're not. I mean, they have a few seats, amongst a total of 128 seats in the parliament. All the same, they can be quite the shifting power in the political game. I'm going to give you an example. Starting 2005, the main Druze party led by Walid Jumblat, okay, the socialist progressist party, has been shifting all the time from one ideology to the next, one coalition to the next, playing sometimes in the Hezbollah on the Hezbollah team and then on the anti-Hezbollah team, depending on the interest of the community, and could shift actually quite quickly. I'm not going to say every week, but sometimes actually that was quite impressive. But I would give really one very telling illustration is what happened in 2011, where basically the legislative elections of 2009 gave the majority to the coalition of March 14, which is the adversary coalition to Hezbollah. So they had the majority in parliament. Obviously, the government was mainly March 14 one, but the difference between the two coalitions was of 3 or 4 seats top. And the Druzes basically had their hands on a political group, a political network within the parliament of 11 MPs. So what happened is just that March 8, the main leaders of March 8, brought Walid Jumblat, the Druze leader, for a coffee. Some talk happened there, and when he went out, he gave a press conference, and suddenly he announced that he was changing gears and that he was no longer on the March 14 side, that he was on the March 8 coalition side, and that shifted the majority within the parliament, actually, without a coup d'etat, without using violence, without new elections. But the Druze basically power, or the Druze party was able on its own to completely shift the majority within the parliament, together with obviously the overthrown of the Hariri government that also brought a new government with a new minister, and this time obviously with a March 8 majority. So the Druses, in terms of number, no, they're not something big, but in the institutional game, if they want to, if they play their card right, they can be quite decisive,
I think that's a very good example of Lebanon itself and the difference and the complexity of the country and its political system. Well, I have many questions more for you, but we're gonna have to leave it here today. Thank you so much, Aurélie and Meray, for these super interesting insights. It was a very enriching conversation. I think it opened new windows of thought and of course a new conversation to continue asking about this long road of recovery and reconstruction. Of course, thank you to the Institute for organizing this seminar and for giving us this space to talk about this very relevant topic. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today to hear this very enriching panel and to listen to Aurélie and Meray and their very interesting thoughts. I also encourage you again to read the articles on the Afkar publication about Lebanon, because they cover other topics that we didn't have the time today. So thank you very much to all of you, and see you next time.